A Hell's Angel was minutes from bankruptcy at 8 a.m. until a shy cashier spotted the mistake. The bell above the supermarket door chimed as Jake, Hellfire McCoy, pushed it open. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on his weathered face. His heavy boots echoed against the linoleum floor, and he couldn't help but notice how other shoppers quickly glanced away when he caught their eye. Jake ran a hand through his thick beard, trying to make himself smaller, an impossible task for a man his size. The sleeves of his leather jacket couldn't quite cover all his tattoos, stark reminders of a past he was trying to leave behind. Each aisle he walked down seemed to empty out just as he entered it. "Just need some groceries," he muttered to himself, grabbing a basket from the stack. The metal handle felt cool against his calloused palm. In the bread aisle, a young mother pulled her child closer as Jake reached for a loaf of wheat bread. The little girl's eyes went wide at his tattoos, and Jake felt that familiar ache in his chest. He offered a small smile, but the mother had already hurried away. "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now back to the story. Jake moved through the store methodically, his shopping list crumpled in his pocket. He picked up eggs, careful not to crack them with his large hands, a carton of milk, some apples that he tested gently for ripeness. Each item went into his basket with careful precision. At the canned goods aisle, he reached for some soup on the top shelf. An elderly woman nearby was struggling to reach the same shelf, her fingers barely grazing the cans she wanted. Jake hesitated, then cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am, would you like some help with that?" The woman startled, taking in his appearance. The skull tattoo visible on his neck, the scars on his knuckles, the leather vest with patches mostly removed but their outline still visible. But something in his voice must have reassured her because she gave a small nod. "The chicken noodle soup, please," she said quietly. "2 cans?" Jake reached up and carefully selected 2 cans, placing them in her cart with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his appearance. The woman murmured a thank you, and for a moment Jake felt a little lighter. Moving through the produce section, he selected some vegetables, trying to remember what he'd learned about picking fresh ones. A stock boy organizing lettuce heads nearly dropped one when Jake appeared around the corner. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jake made his way to the checkout area. His basket wasn't full, but it contained enough for a few days. He chose the shortest line, ending up behind an elderly man who was counting out exact change with shaking hands. When it was finally his turn, Jake stepped forward to the register. The young woman behind the counter, her name tag read Grace, looked up at him with tired but kind eyes. Unlike the others, she didn't flinch at his appearance, though he noticed her hands pause briefly over the register keys. "Did you find everything okay today?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Jake nodded, beginning to unload his basket. As Grace started scanning his items, he reached for his wallet, an inexplicable feeling of dread settling in his stomach. He pulled out his credit card, the plastic worn from use, and waited for Grace to finish ringing up his groceries. She looked up at him with a polite smile, the kind that didn't judge or assume, and Jake found himself wishing more people could look at him that way. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he swiped his credit card through the machine. The small screen blinked for a moment, then let out a harsh beep. A red message flashed. Card declined. His throat tightened. "Must be some mistake," he mumbled, more to himself than to Grace. "Would you like to try again?" Grace asked quietly, her voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the store. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her navy blue apron as she waited. Jake nodded, taking a deep breath. He slid the card through again, slower this time, making sure to follow the diagram on the machine. Another beep, another rejection. "Sometimes the magnetic strip gets worn," Grace offered helpfully. You can try inserting it instead. She pointed to the chip reader at the bottom of the machine. The card felt heavy in Jake's hands as he carefully inserted it into the slot. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. Behind him, he could hear someone shifting their weight impatiently, the rustle of shopping bags, and a child asking their mother why they weren't moving. The machine beeped again. Declined. Sweat began to bead on Jake's forehead. He was painfully aware of his size, of how much space he took up at the register, of how his tattooed hands shook slightly as he pulled out his wallet again to check for another card. "I've got another one here somewhere," he said, his gruff voice strained. The leather of his wallet was worn thin, and there, behind his driver's license, was his backup card. The one he'd been afraid to use because he knew how close to the limit it was. Grace waited patiently, her presence somehow calming despite the tension building in the air. She hadn't called for a manager, hadn't made any announced sounds, hadn't done anything to draw attention to his predicament. Instead, she carefully adjusted some bags near her register, giving him time. The backup card slid through the reader. Jake held his breath. The machine thought about it for what felt like an eternity. Beep. Declined. "No, no, no," Jake whispered, his large hands now visibly shaking. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the store too quiet. He could feel eyes on his back, could practically hear the judgments forming in people's minds. The tough-looking biker can't even pay for his groceries. The total on the display screen, $47.83, seemed to mock him. Just yesterday, he'd checked his account. There should have been enough. Unless that automatic payment he'd forgotten about had gone through. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Sir?" Grace's voice broke through his rising panic. "Would you like to try one more time?" Jake stared at his card, at his calloused fingers holding it. The skull tattoo on his wrist seemed to grin up at him mockingly. Here he was, a former Hell's Angel, who'd once commanded respect with a single look, now unable to buy a few basic groceries. Someone in line behind him sighed loudly. Another person muttered something under their breath. The child from earlier asked, "Mommy, why is that scary man taking so long?" The walls of the supermarket seemed to close in. Jake's chest tightened, each breath becoming more difficult than the last. All his careful planning, all his attempts to build a new life, to start fresh. It was all crumbling around him right here in this fluorescent-lit aisle, with a line of strangers watching his humiliation. His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he tried one final time to swipe the card. Grace watched as Jake's large hands trembled over the card reader. The tough exterior he presented couldn't hide the vulnerability in his eyes. While other customers shuffled impatiently behind him, she noticed something that made her pause. "Sir," she said softly, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Would you mind if I take a look at your receipt for a moment?" Jake handed it over wordlessly, his weathered face etched with defeat. Grace's fingers traced down the lines of items, her brow furrowing as she concentrated. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she compared the items in his bags to the list on the paper. "Something's not right here," she murmured, mostly to herself. Her fingers tapped quietly on the register's keyboard, bringing up the transaction details. "These numbers don't match up with what you bought." Jake leaned forward slightly, his presence less intimidating now despite his size. "What do you mean?" Grace's eyes darted between the screen and the receipt. "The system—" She paused, double-checking her findings. "It looks like it charged you for someone else's items, too, from a previous transaction." Her voice remained steady, but quiet. "The total should be much lower." The tension in Jake's shoulders eased slightly, but worry still creased his forehead. How much lower? Grace's fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard. Your actual total should be $23.41, not $47.83. She glanced up at him briefly. The system sometimes glitches like this. It's adding items from an earlier transaction to yours. Jake's breath came out in a rush. That would explain it. Without drawing attention to herself, Grace began the process of correcting the error. Her movements were efficient but unhurried, trying not to make the situation any more stressful than it already was. The other customers in line continued their impatient shuffling, but she kept her focus on fixing the mistake. I'm going to void this transaction, she explained softly, and ring everything up again. That should take care of it. Her fingers moved deliberately across the keys, careful not to make any mistakes. Jake stood quietly, his large frame somehow seeming smaller as he watched her work. The tattoos on his hands stood out starkly as he gripped the edge of the counter, waiting. Grace scanned his items again, making sure each one registered correctly this time. The total appeared on the screen, $23.41. Would you like to try your card now? She asked, looking up at him with a gentle smile. Jake nodded, sliding his card through the reader once more. The machine whirred softly, processing the transaction. The seconds stretched out, and Grace noticed how Jake held his breath. The machine chirped pleasantly. Approved, Grace said, relief evident in her voice. Jake's shoulders sagged as the tension drained from his body. Thank you, he said, his gruff voice barely above a whisper. You didn't have to. Most people wouldn't have. It was the right thing to do, Grace replied simply, handing him his receipt. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw genuine gratitude in his weathered face. Jake gathered his bags, his movements more steady now. Thank you, he said again, more firmly this time. Really? Grace just nodded, already turning to the next customer, but she caught the look of wonder on Jake's face as he walked away. The look of someone who hadn't expected kindness but had received it anyway. Jake pushed through the supermarket's glass doors, his plastic bags rustling in the morning breeze. The parking lot stretched before him, half empty at this early hour. His heavy boots scraped against the asphalt as he walked, each step slower than usual as his mind wandered back to what had just happened inside. The gentle hum of traffic from the nearby street filled the air, but Jake barely noticed it. He couldn't shake the image of the cashier's quiet determination as she'd worked to fix his problem. Grace. He'd caught her name on the badge pinned to her blue uniform vest. Such a fitting name for someone who'd shown him such unexpected kindness. His truck sat alone at the far end of the parking lot, where he always parked to avoid drawing attention. The old Ford had seen better days, its red paint faded to a dull rust color. Jake loaded his groceries into the passenger seat, his movements mechanical, while his thoughts stayed fixed on Grace's actions. Didn't have to help me, he muttered to himself, settling into the driver's seat. The springs creaked under his weight as he gripped the steering wheel, not yet starting the engine. Most people took one look at his tattoos, his scarred knuckles, his thick beard, and decided he wasn't worth their time. But she hadn't hesitated to step in when she saw something wrong. The drive home was a blur of familiar streets and stop signs. Jake's apartment building came into view, a weathered 3-story structure with peeling paint and crooked window blinds. He parked in his usual spot beneath a dying oak tree, its few remaining leaves scattered across his windshield. Inside his ground-floor apartment, Jake set his groceries on the small kitchen counter. The place was clean but sparse, just the basics, nothing fancy. A fold-out table against one wall, a worn armchair facing an old TV, and a narrow hallway leading to his bedroom. The morning light filtered weakly through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. His hands shook slightly as he pulled his phone from his pocket. Jake lowered himself into the armchair, its familiar creak a small comfort as he opened his banking app. The numbers on the screen made his stomach clench. Just as he'd feared, his account balance was dangerously low. A few $100s stood between him and complete financial ruin. If Grace hadn't caught that mistake at the register... Jake ran a hand through his beard, letting out a long breath. That extra charge would have pushed him over the edge. One simple error could have been the final push into bankruptcy, the last domino to fall in a long line of financial mishaps. He stared at the numbers on his phone screen, remembering Grace's careful attention to detail, her quiet voice as she explained the error. Such a small act of kindness, but it had made all the difference. In his former life with the Angels, kindness was seen as weakness. But there had been nothing weak about the way Grace had handled the situation, just quiet competence and genuine concern. Jake set his phone down on the scratched coffee table and leaned back in his chair. The morning sun had risen higher now, warming his face through the window. He was still in trouble. The numbers in his account made that clear enough. But thanks to Grace's intervention, he had a little more time to figure things out. For now, that would have to be enough. Jake tossed and turned in his bed, the sheets tangling around his legs. The dim glow of streetlights filtered through his thin curtains, casting strange shadows on the wall. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's face, the gentle concern in her expression, the way her hands moved efficiently as she fixed the register's mistake. The old wall clock in his bedroom ticked steadily, marking each passing hour. 2 a.m. came and went. Then 3. His mind wouldn't settle, replaying the scene at the supermarket over and over. In all his years running with the Angels, kindness had been rare. People either feared him or wanted something from him. But Grace had been different. She'd helped him simply because it was the right thing to do. Jake sat up, running his hands over his face. His tattoos seemed darker in the nighttime shadows, reminders of a past he was trying to leave behind. The skull on his forearm grinned up at him mockingly. Back then, he'd worn his tough exterior like armor. Now it felt more like a wall keeping people at a distance. The springs creaked as he got out of bed, padding barefoot to the kitchen. The linoleum was cold under his feet. He filled a glass with tap water, leaning against the counter as he drank. Through his kitchen window, he could see the empty street below, a single flickering streetlight creating pools of yellow light on the wet pavement. What had made Grace step forward? Most people would have just let him deal with his embarrassment, maybe even enjoyed seeing the big, scary biker brought low by a declined card. But she'd noticed something wasn't right and took the initiative to help. It wasn't just what she'd done, it was how she'd done it. Quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to his situation. 4 a.m. found him in his armchair, staring at the dark TV screen. He'd learned to read people during his years on the street, and something about Grace's demeanor stuck with him. The way she'd kept her eyes down, how her voice had been barely above a whisper. She'd helped him while trying to remain invisible herself. As the first gray light of dawn crept through his windows, Jake made up his mind. He needed to thank her properly. His mama, rest her soul, had taught him that much at least. When someone shows you kindness, you acknowledge it. He showered and dressed with purpose, choosing his least threatening outfit, a plain black t-shirt that covered most of his tattoos and his newer pair of jeans. He even trimmed his beard a bit, trying to soften his appearance. The mirror reflected back a man trying hard to look approachable, though his weathered face and massive frame made that a challenge. The supermarket parking lot was busier than yesterday when Jake pulled in around 9 a.m. He parked in the same spot as before, taking a deep breath before heading inside. The automatic doors slid open with a familiar whoosh, and the cool, air-conditioned breeze hit his face. Jake's eyes went straight to the checkout area. Register 3, where Grace had been yesterday, was open but staffed by someone else, a teenage boy with acne and a bored expression. He scanned the other registers, looking for Grace's slight frame and quiet presence, but she wasn't there. A feeling of unease settled in his stomach as he stood just inside the entrance, watching the morning bustle of shopping carts and customers. Jake approached the customer service desk, where a middle-aged woman with graying hair was sorting through papers. She looked up at him, and he noticed how she instinctively took a small step back. "Excuse me," Jake said, keeping his voice soft. "I'm looking for Grace, the cashier who was working Register 3 yesterday morning." The woman's expression shifted from wariness to something else. Was that sympathy? "Oh, Grace. She's no longer with us." Jake's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "I really shouldn't discuss personnel matters," she said, shuffling the papers in her hands. Jake leaned forward slightly, his large frame casting a shadow over the desk. "Please. She helped me yesterday, and I just wanted to thank her." The woman glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Between us, she was let go yesterday afternoon, right after her shift." Jake felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "Can I speak with the manager?" "Mr. Peterson, he's in his office." She pointed to a door marked Management near the back of the store. Jake's boots seemed heavier with each step as he walked to the manager's office. He knocked on the door, his knuckles barely touching the wood in an attempt to be gentle. "Come in," called a voice from inside. Mr. Peterson was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual frown. He looked up from his computer screen, his frown deepening when he saw Jake. "Can I help you?" "I want to know about Grace," Jake said, remaining in the doorway. "The cashier you fired yesterday." "As I told Mrs. Winters, we don't discuss." "She was helping me," Jake interrupted. "There was a problem with my transaction, and she fixed it." Mr. Peterson's expression hardened. "Yes, she did. She improperly handled a transaction, circumventing our established procedures. We can't have employees making up their own rules." "She didn't make up rules," Jake said, his voice growing tight. "The system overcharged me. She caught the mistake. She should have called a supervisor." Mr. Peterson straightened some papers on his desk. "Besides, this wasn't her first warning about being too creative with solutions. We need employees who follow protocol." Jake's fingers curled into fists at his sides. He forced them to relax, remembering his promise to himself to leave violence in the past. "So you fired her for doing the right thing?" "We fired her for not following proper procedures." Mr. Peterson's tone was dismissive. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Jake stood there for a moment longer, looking at the manager who had so casually ruined someone's livelihood. Then he turned and walked out, his jaw clenched tight. In the parking lot, Jake sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel. Grace had lost her job because she'd helped him, because she'd shown kindness to a stranger who looked like trouble. The guilt sat heavy in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He thought about Grace's quiet demeanor, how she'd tried to help without drawing attention to herself or to him. Now he understood why. She'd probably been walking on eggshells, knowing she was already in trouble with management. Jake started his truck, the engine rumbling to life. He couldn't leave it like this. He had to find her, had to make this right somehow. Grace had reached out to help him when he needed it. Now it was his turn to do the same for her. Jake pulled his truck into the parking lot of Mel's Diner, the third restaurant he'd visited that morning. The neon "Open" sign buzzed faintly in the window, and the smell of coffee and bacon drifted through the air. Inside, a bell chimed as he pushed open the door. An older waitress with graying hair pulled into a tight bun looked up from wiping down the counter. Her name tag read, Betty. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for a mug. Jake nodded and settled onto a worn vinyl stool. "Thanks." He wrapped his hands around the warm cup, studying the scattered customers having their breakfast. "I'm actually looking for someone. Grace Winters? She used to work at Thompson's supermarket." Betty's movement slowed as she poured the coffee. "Grace? Sweet girl. Always quiet but hard-working." She set the pot down and leaned against the counter. "Heard what happened at Thompson's. Shame, really. That girl's got enough on her plate as it is." Jake's interest piqued. "What do you mean?" "Well," Betty lowered her voice, glancing around. "She's got a little one at home. Tommy, I think his name is. Poor kid's been sick on and off. Medical bills must be through the roof." She shook her head. She used to pick up shifts here on weekends, but had to quit when Tommy's health got worse. Jake felt the weight in his chest grow heavier. "Does she work anywhere else?" "Last I heard, she was cleaning houses during the day and working nights at the gas station out on Route 40. Betty's face softened with concern. "That girl works herself to the bone, trying to keep everything together." Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the information sink in. A sick kid, multiple jobs, and now, because of him, one less source of income. He spent the next 2 days visiting other businesses in town, piecing together Grace's story. At the library, an elderly volunteer remembered Grace bringing Tommy in for story time before his illness got worse. At the pharmacy, the technician mentioned how Grace always tried to smile, even when picking up expensive prescriptions. Finally, at the gas station, Jake found someone who knew where Grace lived. "She's in those apartments on Cedar Street," the night clerk told him. "The old brick building near the park. Number 12, I think." Jake drove by the address that evening. The building was worn, but well kept, with small flower boxes hanging from some windows. A children's bicycle was chained to the rack out front, its paint faded and chipped. He parked across the street, watching as lights came on in various windows as the sky darkened. Through one window, he caught a glimpse of Grace moving past, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Jake gripped his steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The image of Grace helping him at the supermarket flashed through his mind, how she'd noticed his distress and quietly stepped in to help. No judgment, no hesitation, just simple kindness. Now here she was, struggling alone, probably worried sick about how to make ends meet. His jaw clenched as he thought about Mr. Peterson's dismissive attitude, about how easily some people could destroy others' lives without a second thought. He couldn't leave things like this. Grace had shown him kindness when he needed it most, and now she needed help. The question was, what could someone like him, an ex-biker with a troubled past and dwindling savings, possibly do to make things right? Jake sat in his truck, watching the warm light from Grace's window, and felt his resolve hardening into determination. He might not have much, but he had to try something. He owed her that much. The evening air had turned cool as Jake stood before apartment number 12, his heart pounding against his ribs. The brick building loomed over him, its weathered facade a testament to years of housing working-class families. A lone moth fluttered around the dim hallway light, casting shifting shadows on the worn welcome mat at Grace's door. He wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and took a deep breath. The leather of his jacket creaked as he raised his hand and knocked 3 times, each rap echoing in the quiet hallway. For a moment, there was silence. Then, soft footsteps approached from inside. The door opened just a crack, held by a security chain, and Grace's tired face appeared in the gap. Her eyes widened with recognition. "Mr. McCoy." Her voice was barely above a whisper. She glanced nervously down the hallway, as if checking to see if anyone else was there. "Just Jake, please," he said, trying to keep his voice gentle despite his gruff appearance. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Grace hesitated, then closed the door. Jake heard the chain sliding, and the door opened wider. She stood in the doorway, wearing simple jeans and a faded sweater, her brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. "How did you find me?" she asked, wrapping her arms around herself. Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I asked around town. I know I shouldn't have, but..." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I needed to talk to you about what happened at the supermarket." From inside the apartment, a small cough echoed, followed by the quiet sound of cartoons playing on TV. Grace glanced back over her shoulder, her motherly instinct evident in the gesture. "I heard you lost your job because of me," Jake continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Because you helped me when I needed it, and I can't let that stand." Grace's cheeks flushed. "It wasn't your fault. I knew the rules about adjusting transactions. I made that choice. But you shouldn't have had to make that choice." Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I know about Tommy's medical bills. Please, let me help." Grace's eyes widened as she stared at the envelope. Her hands trembled slightly, and she took a small step back. I can't accept that. It's too much." "It's not charity," Jake insisted, holding the envelope out. "It's me making things right. You helped me when I was at my lowest, Grace. Let me return the favor." Grace shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mr. McCoy, Jake, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't take your money. We'll manage somehow. We always do." Another small cough came from inside, and Grace's face crumpled slightly before she composed herself. She straightened her shoulders, though, and gave Jake a weak smile. "Thank you for the offer, but please, it's too much. I'd be too embarrassed to accept it." Jake stood there, the envelope still extended, feeling helpless in the face of her quiet dignity. The moth continued its dance around the hallway light, casting shifting shadows between them. Jake sat in his truck outside Grace's apartment building, the rejected envelope heavy in his pocket. The engine ticked as it cooled in the evening air. His large hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with frustration. The image of Grace's tired eyes and proud refusal wouldn't leave his mind. "Money's not the answer," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. The leather seat creaked as he leaned back, staring at the building's brick facade. A gentle rain started to fall, creating tiny rivers down his windshield. His thoughts drifted back to the supermarket. The fluorescent lights, the squeaky floors, the place where Grace had shown him kindness. Something clicked in his mind. Maybe there was another way to help. Something bigger than just throwing money at the problem. Jake pulled out his phone and searched for the supermarket's name. His rough fingers tapped against the screen as he scrolled through local news articles. One headline caught his eye. "Local supermarket struggles amid economic downturn." "That's it," he whispered, sitting up straighter. The rain picked up, drumming steadily on the truck's roof. He began reading more intently, his eyes moving quickly across the screen. The store's owner was looking to sell. The business was struggling but still viable. Jake's heart began to race. He'd never run a store before, but he'd managed businesses in his younger days, legitimate ones, after leaving the Angels. His savings account held enough for a decent down payment. It was crazy, but maybe? He opened his banking app, and checked his balance. The numbers stared back at him, representing years of careful saving after turning his life around. It would be tight, but it might just work. "This is insane," he said to himself, running a hand through his beard. But the more he thought about it, the more right it felt. He could give Grace her job back. Better than that, he could give her a real career, a chance to provide for her son without working herself to exhaustion. His hands shook slightly as he dialed the number of Sarah Chen, a real estate agent he'd worked with years ago when buying his apartment. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. Sarah Chen speaking. "Sarah, it's Jake McCoy." He cleared his throat. "Remember that favor you owe me from the apartment deal?" "Jake, of course I remember. What's on your mind?" He took a deep breath. "I need information about Miller's Supermarket on Oak Street. I heard it's for sale." There was a pause on the other end. "The supermarket? Jake, that's quite different from anything you've looked at before." "I know it sounds crazy," he said, watching the rain blur the world outside his windshield. "But I need to know everything. Asking price, financial statements, the whole picture." Sarah's typing could be heard through the phone. "Give me a day to gather the information, but Jake..." She hesitated. "Are you sure about this? Running a supermarket is complicated business." Jake looked up at Grace's apartment window, where a soft light still glowed. "I'm not sure of anything right now, Sarah, but I need to try. Can you help me?" More typing sounds came through the line. "I'll make some calls first thing tomorrow. The owner's been trying to sell for a while, so that works in our favor." "Thanks, Sarah." Jake's voice was gruff with emotion. "I appreciate it." After hanging up, Jake sat in his truck for a long moment, listening to the rain. The enormity of what he was considering settled over him like a heavy blanket. He had no idea if this would work, or if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But as he thought of Grace's quiet strength and her refusal to accept charity, he knew he had to try something bigger than just offering money. The morning sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Jake's apartment as he spread the financial documents across his kitchen table. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten amid the sea of papers Sarah had delivered. The numbers weren't great, but they weren't as bad as he'd feared. Jake ran his calloused fingers through his beard, studying the profit and loss statements. The supermarket was struggling, but not dying. It just needed someone who cared enough to turn it around. His eyes drifted to the loan application forms sitting at the corner of the table, still blank. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "The owner's willing to negotiate," she said without preamble. "He's motivated to sell quickly." Jake's heart thumped harder. "How much?" Sarah named a figure that made him wince. It would take everything he had saved, plus a substantial loan. The thought made his stomach churn, but Grace's face flashed in his mind, her quiet dignity, her gentle strength. "I'll do it," he said, his voice gruff with determination. "Jake, are you absolutely sure? This is a huge risk." He looked around his sparse apartment, everything he owned paid for with honest work after leaving his old life behind. "Sometimes you gotta take risks for the right reasons, Sarah." The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork. Jake's hand cramped from signing documents, each signature feeling heavier than the last. The loan officer at the bank raised his eyebrows at Jake's tattoos, but couldn't deny his excellent credit score and solid savings. "It's unusual," the loan officer said, adjusting his tie, "for someone to buy a business in this condition." Jake met the man's eyes steadily. Sometimes unusual is exactly what's needed. By late afternoon, Jake sat in the bank's conference room, surrounded by even more paperwork. His savings account had been drained to a fraction of its former size. The loan agreement lay before him, requiring one final signature. His hand hesitated over the paper. Sarah touched his arm gently. "You can still back out." Jake thought about Grace, about second chances, about redemption. He'd spent years trying to prove he was more than his past. Maybe this was his chance to prove it to himself. He signed. The bank officer nodded, gathering the papers. "Congratulations, Mr. McCoy. You're now the owner of Miller's Supermarket." Jake stood, feeling slightly dazed. Sarah handed him a set of keys. His keys now. They felt impossibly heavy in his palm. "The current staff has been notified of the ownership change," Sarah said, walking him to his truck. "You can take possession immediately." Jake climbed into his vehicle, staring at the keys in his hand. The morning sun caught the metal, making them gleam. His heart raced with equal parts excitement and terror. He'd just committed nearly everything he owned to this gamble. "What have I done?" he whispered, but it wasn't really a question. He knew exactly what he'd done. He'd taken the biggest risk of his life, all because a quiet cashier had shown him kindness when he needed it most. The weight of responsibility settled over him like a heavy blanket. He was now responsible for not just his own future, but the livelihoods of his employees. And hopefully soon, Grace would be among them. The morning light spilled through the freshly cleaned windows of the supermarket, casting long shadows across the newly polished floors. Jake stood at the entrance, his hands fidgeting with his collar. He'd traded his usual leather jacket for a button-down shirt, though he couldn't bring himself to cover his tattoos completely. The sleeve tattoos peeked out from under his rolled-up cuffs, telling stories of his past life. "Everything's ready, Mr. McCoy," said Maria, one of the longtime employees who'd stayed on. She held a clipboard against her chest, giving him an encouraging smile. "The shelves are stocked, the registers are updated, and we've got all hands on deck." Jake nodded, his throat tight. He'd spent the last week overseeing renovations, updating equipment, and learning more about grocery management than he ever thought he'd need to know. The savings he'd poured into this place showed in the fresh paint, bright lights, and new signage outside. "Thanks, Maria." He glanced at his watch. "Time to open up." As he walked to unlock the front doors, Jake's eyes scanned the parking lot. A small crowd had gathered, curious locals eager to see what changes the ex-biker had made to their neighborhood store. But among the faces, he couldn't find the one he was looking for. Grace hadn't returned his calls, and his invitation to the reopening had gone unanswered. The door chimes tinkled as the first customers entered. Jake stood back, trying to smile as people walked past. Some nodded politely. Others stared at his tattoos with uncertainty. A few regular customers from the old store offered words of encouragement. "Nice to see someone breathing new life into this place," said an elderly woman, patting his arm as she walked by with her cart. Jake moved through the aisles, watching as shoppers explored the renovated store. He'd kept the layout familiar, but made improvements where needed. New freezer cases hummed efficiently. The produce section sparkled under enhanced lighting, and the checkout area had been modernized with updated registers. "The bread aisle looks great," commented a young mother, her toddler seated in the cart. "And those prices are really reasonable." Jake managed a smile, but his stomach churned. Those low prices were a gamble, part of his strategy to win back customers and compete with the bigger stores in nearby towns. But every discount ate into his already thin margins. By mid-morning, the store was steadily busy. Jake stood near the front windows, watching people come and go. Each ring of the cash register brought both hope and anxiety. He'd invested everything in this place, and now his future hung on whether these customers would return tomorrow, next week, next month. Sarah, his realtor, stopped by around lunchtime. "The place looks amazing, Jake," she said, looking around appreciatively. "How's the first day going?" People are shopping, he replied, his voice gruff with tension. Time will tell if it's enough. And Grace? Sarah asked carefully. Any word from her? Jake shook his head, his jaw tightening. The empty register where she used to work seemed to mock him. He'd bought this place to help her, to make things right. But now he wondered if he'd made a colossal mistake. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical thing, making his shoulders sag. A young cashier called for assistance with a register issue, and Jake moved to help, pushing aside his doubts. He had to focus on making this work, even if Grace never walked through those doors again. Too many people were counting on him now, his employees, his customers, the bank. He couldn't afford to let his personal feelings get in the way of running this business. But as he fixed the register problem, he couldn't help glancing at the door every time the bells chimed, hoping to see a familiar face. Jake sat in his small office at the back of the supermarket, staring at a piece of paper with Grace's address scribbled on it. He'd finally gotten it from Maria, who knew Grace from their time working together. The first day's sales numbers lay forgotten on his desk, as his mind wandered to the empty manager's position he still needed to fill. The evening sun cast long shadows through the blinds as he drove his old pickup truck through the quieter part of town. The streets narrowed, and the houses grew smaller and closer together. Jake's truck rumbled to a stop outside a modest apartment complex, its faded brick exterior showing years of wear. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, his heavy boots echoing in the stairwell. At apartment 2B, he hesitated before knocking. The door opened slightly, held by a security chain. Grace? Jake's voice was softer than usual. Can we talk? The door closed, then opened fully. Grace stood there, looking tired and worn. Dark circles under her eyes told of sleepless nights, and her shoulders carried the weight of exhaustion. Behind her, Jake could see a small living room with toys scattered about and a pile of medical bills on the coffee table. I've been trying to reach you, Jake said, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Grace wrapped her arms around herself. I know. I'm sorry. Tommy's been sick again. We spent 3 days at the hospital last week. Jake's expression softened. Is he okay? He's sleeping now. Grace glanced back into the apartment. The doctors say he's stable, but... Her voice trailed off, and she blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. Can I come in? Just for a minute? Grace hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside. The apartment was small but clean, despite the chaos of caring for a sick child. A half-eaten bowl of cereal sat on the kitchen counter, and a blanket was crumpled on the couch where Grace had probably been catching moments of rest between caring for Tommy. I heard you bought the store, Grace said quietly, clearing some toys from a chair so Jake could sit. Yeah. Jake remained standing, his large frame making the small room feel even smaller. That's actually why I'm here. I need a manager. Grace looked up sharply. What? Someone who knows the store, the customers, the employees, someone who cares about doing things right? Jake met her eyes. Someone like you. Me. Grace shook her head. Jake, I can't. Tommy needs me. The medical bills. The position comes with full health insurance, Jake said quickly. Better pay than before, flexible hours. You could work around Tommy's appointments. Grace sank into the couch, overwhelmed. Why are you doing this? Because you helped me when no one else would, Jake replied honestly. And because you're the right person for the job. Through the thin walls, they could hear a child's cough from the bedroom. Grace's eyes darted toward the sound, her maternal instincts evident. I don't know, she said, twisting her hands in her lap. It's a lot to take on, and after what happened last time, she trailed off, remembering her firing. What if I mess up again? You didn't mess up before, Jake insisted. You did the right thing. That's exactly why I want you running the store. Grace stood and paced to the window, hugging herself tightly. The setting sun painted the room in warm oranges and reds, highlighting the worry on her face. It would change everything, she whispered, more to herself than to Jake. I don't know if I can handle any more changes right now. The silence in Grace's small apartment grew heavy as she sank back onto the worn couch. Her fingers traced invisible patterns on the armrest, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the distance. Jake remained standing, his imposing figure softened by the concern etched on his weathered face. Grace's voice quivered. I'm scared, Jake. What if I can't handle it? What if I make another mistake? She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. You've invested so much in this store. I don't want to be the reason it fails. Jake pulled over one of the kitchen chairs, its legs scraping softly against the linoleum floor. He sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Grace, you're the most capable person I've met in this town. The way you handle everything on your plate. He gestured around the apartment at the evidence of her busy life as a single mother. That takes real strength. A weak smile flickered across Grace's face. Being overwhelmed isn't the same as being strong. No, Jake agreed, his voice gentle. But keeping going when you're overwhelmed? That's what makes you strong. Through the thin walls, they could hear Tommy stirring in his sleep. Grace's attention immediately shifted toward the sound, her body tensing slightly until the apartment fell quiet again. The store needs someone like you, Jake continued. Someone who sees people, not just customers. Someone who understands what it's like to struggle. He paused, running a hand through his graying beard. I know about running from the past, Grace, but sometimes you've got to stop running and take a chance. Grace stood and walked to the kitchen window, wrapping her arms around herself. The streetlights were starting to come on outside, casting long shadows across the parking lot below. It's not just about me anymore, she said softly. Every decision I make affects Tommy. That's exactly why you should consider it, Jake replied. Better pay, health insurance, stable hours. You wouldn't have to work 3 jobs anymore. Grace turned back to face him, her expression torn between hope and fear. And what if I fail? What then? Then we figure it out together, Jake said firmly. The position is yours if you want it. No pressure, no strings attached. Just then, Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning at the screen. Sorry, I need to take this. It's my financial advisor. He stepped into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind him. Grace could hear his muffled voice through the door, growing increasingly tense. When he returned a few minutes later, his face had lost some of its color. Everything okay? Grace asked, noting the change in his demeanor. Jake ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking tired. Just some unexpected complications with the store's finances. Nothing for you to worry about. But his voice lacked conviction, and Grace could see the tension in his shoulders. Jake? She pressed gently. What's wrong? He sank back into the chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The store's debt. It's worse than I thought. A lot worse. He looked up at her, his eyes troubled. But that doesn't change anything about my offer. The position is still yours if you want it. Grace stood there, watching this man who had already risked so much trying to help her, now facing even bigger challenges than before. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her shoulders as she considered what to say next. Jake sat at his makeshift desk, a folding table crammed into what used to be the supermarket's storage closet. Stacks of papers surrounded him, each one spelling out trouble in bold black numbers. His hands were stained with ink from going through endless invoices and receipts. The small desk lamp cast harsh shadows across his tired face. He rubbed his eyes, trying to focus on the figures in front of him. The clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m., but time had lost all meaning hours ago. Outside his office, the empty aisles of the supermarket stood silent, waiting for tomorrow's customers. "This can't be right," he muttered, double-checking a column of numbers. The outstanding bills were piling up faster than he could keep track. Supplier invoices, utility payments, and maintenance costs seemed to multiply every time he looked away. Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled through his recent calls. Grace's name appeared near the top. He'd talked to her earlier about starting next week. The memory of her cautious optimism gave him a fresh surge of determination. He couldn't let her down, not after everything. His calculator clicked steadily as he worked through another set of figures. Each total made his stomach sink a little lower. The store's previous owners had left behind more problems than he'd realized. The refrigeration units needed repairs, the inventory system was outdated, and several vendors were threatening to cut them off unless old debts were paid. Running his hands through his beard, Jake stood up and paced the small office. His motorcycle boots echoed against the linoleum floor. The tattoos on his arms, remnants of his wilder days, seemed to mock him. What did an ex-biker know about running a business? But then he remembered Grace's face when he'd offered her the manager position. The way hope had flickered in her eyes, fighting against years of disappointment and struggle. He thought about Tommy, her son, and how this job could change their lives. "Come on, McCoy," he growled at himself. "Figure it out." He returned to his desk and pulled out his personal bank statements. His savings were almost depleted from buying the store, and his credit cards were maxed out from covering emergency repairs. He'd been avoiding looking too closely at his own finances, focusing instead on keeping the store afloat. His phone buzzed, making him jump. The screen showed his financial advisor's number. Jake's heart rate picked up. Mark never called this late unless it was important. "Mark?" Jake answered, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "Jake, we need to talk." Mark's tone was grave. "I've been going through the numbers you sent me." Jake's grip tightened on the phone. "How bad is it?" "It's worse than we thought." Mark paused. The store's previous owners, they weren't just disorganized. They were hiding debts, big ones. The room seemed to tilt slightly as Mark continued, laying out the harsh reality in precise terms. Outstanding loans, unpaid taxes, deferred maintenance costs. It was all adding up to a number that made Jake's head spin. "And Jake?" Mark added, his voice softening. "I looked at your personal finances too, with the money you've already put into the store." He trailed off. Jake sank into his chair, the cheap plastic creaking under his weight. The desk lamp flickered, as if even it was struggling to stay on. "Just tell me, Mark." "You're not just in the red, Jake. You're looking at potential bankruptcy if something doesn't change fast." Jake stared at his phone long after Mark had hung up. The harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead, matching the static in his mind. His financial advisor's words echoed in his head. Potential bankruptcy. The phrase felt like a punch to the gut. He pushed away from his desk and walked to the store's front windows. The empty parking lot stretched before him, lit by a single flickering street lamp. His motorcycle sat alone under it, a reminder of simpler days when his biggest worry was where the open road would take him. "What am I doing?" he muttered, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The tattoos on his arms seemed to mock him. Skulls and flames from a past life when he thought he was invincible. Now here he was, trying to run a failing supermarket, pretending he could be something he wasn't. Jake pulled out his wallet and found the crumpled receipt from that first day. The day Grace had helped him. He smoothed it out, studying the faded numbers. One small act of kindness had sparked all this, and now he was in deeper trouble than before. His phone buzzed with a text from his landlord, reminding him that rent was due tomorrow. Jake hadn't even thought about his own bills, too focused on keeping the store afloat. He could sell the store now, cut his losses before things got worse, maybe even recover some of his savings. The thought felt like acid in his stomach. Walking through the empty aisles, Jake ran his hand along the shelves. Some were half empty because he couldn't afford to fully stock them. The produce section needed new display cases. The checkout counters needed updating. Everything needed something, and he was running out of money to fix any of it. He stopped at Register 3, Grace's old station. The memory of her quiet determination that day hit him hard. She hadn't hesitated to help him, even though it cost her job. And now here he was, thinking about walking away when things got tough. Back in his office, Jake slumped into his chair. His eyes fell on the employment contract he'd drawn up for Grace, still unsigned. He pictured her face when he'd offered her the manager position. That mix of hope and fear, the way her hands had trembled slightly as she'd considered the possibility of a better life. The weight of his Hell's Angels jacket had never felt as heavy as the responsibility he carried now. But something else stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Jake stood and walked back to the window, watching as a light rain began to fall. His reflection stared back at him. Graying beard, tired eyes, weathered face. Behind that tough exterior, he saw something new. Determination. He thought about Grace's quiet strength, how she kept going despite everything life threw at her. She'd shown him kindness when he least expected it, when he thought he was beyond help. Maybe that's what this was all about, not just saving a supermarket or offering someone a job, but proving that change was possible. No, he couldn't walk away. Not from Grace, not from this chance to make something right. He might be facing bankruptcy, but he'd faced worse odds before. This time, though, he was fighting for something bigger than himself. Jake turned away from the window and headed back to his desk. He had work to do. Jake stood in front of his whiteboard, marker in hand, studying the list of ideas he'd scrawled across its surface. Family movie night in the parking lot and weekend farmer's market jumped out at him. Simple ideas, but maybe they could work. His sleeve caught on the corner of his desk as he reached for his coffee, revealing the faded flames tattooed on his forearm. The old Jake would have laughed at the idea of organizing community events. But the old Jake hadn't known Grace either. He picked up his phone and dialed the local radio station. "Hey there, this is Jake McCoy from Valley Market," he said, his gruff voice softening as he explained his plan for a weekend event. The station manager seemed excited. Small towns were always hungry for something new. Over the next few days, Jake threw himself into preparations. He cleared the parking lot and borrowed folding chairs from the church down the street. Local vendors, excited by the prospect of a new venue, signed up for spots at his makeshift farmer's market. The whole thing felt strange to him, a former Hell's Angel organizing family events, but he kept pushing forward. On Saturday morning, Jake arrived early to set up. The sun hadn't fully risen when he started arranging tables and putting up signs advertising special grand opening discounts. His hands, more used to working on motorcycles than hanging decorations, felt clumsy with the bright streamers. People started trickling in around 9. At first, just a few curious onlookers, then more as word spread. Kids dragged their parents to the popcorn machine he'd rented. Elderly couples browsed the local produce stands. The parking lot hummed with conversation and laughter. Inside the store, Jake had marked down prices on essential items. "First week special," signs dotted the aisles. He watched as shopping carts filled up, each purchase helping to chip away at the store's debt. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Every time the door chimed, Jake looked up, hoping to see Grace. He'd sent her a text about the event, but received no response. Still, he'd set aside the manager's contract, ready if she changed her mind. The following weeks brought more changes. Jake started a Local Product of the Week feature, showcasing items from nearby farms and businesses. He organized evening cooking demonstrations in the store's deli section. Each small success built on the last. The numbers started to improve. Not dramatically, but enough to give Jake hope. Regular customers returned, bringing friends and family. The empty shelves slowly filled again. The produce section got its new display cases. But Grace's absence weighed on him. He'd drive past her apartment sometimes, seeing lights on but never gathering the courage to knock. Once, he spotted her at the doctor's office with her child, but she'd hurried away before he could approach. One evening, as Jake closed up the store, he noticed someone had left a note in the suggestion box. The handwriting looked familiar. "The new changes are wonderful," it read. "You're doing a good thing here." It wasn't signed, but Jake knew who had written it. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his wallet, right next to that old receipt from his first visit. The store was starting to feel like home now, filled with the warmth of community support. But without Grace there to share in its recovery, something still felt missing. Jake locked the front doors and walked to his motorcycle. The evening air carried the scent of approaching autumn. He'd come this far. He just had to keep going, keep building, keep hoping that somehow Grace would find her way back. The morning sun cast long shadows across Valley Market's parking lot as Jake wheeled out the last shopping cart from the collection area. A month had passed since his first community event, and the change was visible everywhere he looked. The once empty parking lot now had a steady stream of cars coming and going. Inside, the fluorescent lights illuminated freshly stocked shelves. Mrs. Peterson, a regular customer in her 70s, waved at Jake as she picked through the local apples he'd gotten from Thompson's farm just outside town. "These are wonderful, Jake," she said, holding up a crisp, red delicious. "Just like the ones my father used to grow." Jake nodded, his weathered face breaking into a small smile. "Got them in fresh this morning, Mrs. Peterson." The store's transformation wasn't just physical. The atmosphere had shifted from the impersonal feel of a chain store to something warmer, more personal. Jake had learned all the regular customers' names, and they'd stopped flinching at his tattoos and gruff exterior. Sarah from the bakery department approached him with a clipboard. "The orders for next week's bread drive are in. We've got 30 families signed up already." The bread drive had been Linda Cooper's idea. She'd mentioned how some families struggled to afford basics, and Jake had immediately set up a program where customers could buy bread at cost. The community's response had been overwhelming. At the customer service desk, Tommy, a local high school student Jake had hired part-time, was helping an elderly man with his grocery bags. The boy's earnest assistance reminded Jake of Grace's gentle way with customers. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the day ahead. The afternoon brought more customers, including some faces Jake hadn't seen before. Word had spread about Valley Market's transformation, drawing people from neighboring towns. The deli counter, which Jake had expanded to include local meats and cheeses, had a constant line. "Hey, Jake," called Bill Thompson, the apple farmer, who'd stopped by to deliver more produce. "Heard about your community appreciation event tomorrow. Count me in. I'll bring some fresh cider." Jake had been planning the event for weeks. He'd arranged for food trucks, set up picnic tables, and organized games for kids. It was his way of thanking the community for their support, though part of him hoped it might also draw Grace back. The local paper had run a story about the store's turnaround. "Local business revival, former biker transforms struggling supermarket," read the headline. Jake kept the article posted on the bulletin board, not out of pride, but as a reminder of how far they'd come. By closing time, Jake stood in the middle of his store, taking in the busy day's aftermath. The shelves needed restocking, but they weren't empty anymore. The floors needed sweeping, but they were dirty from customer traffic, not neglect. As he prepared for tomorrow's event, setting up tables and chairs in the parking lot, Jake felt a mix of emotions: pride in what he'd accomplished, gratitude for the community's support, and a lingering sadness that Grace wasn't there to see it all. The evening air grew cool as Jake hung strings of lights between the lampposts. Tomorrow, these same lights would shine over families enjoying free hot dogs and ice cream, children playing games, and neighbors catching up with each other. He'd even arranged for face painting and a local band to play. Everything was ready. Jake stepped back to survey his work, hoping that somewhere in town, Grace might be planning to attend. But he couldn't be sure. She still hadn't responded to his invitation. The community event was in full swing. Children darted between tables with painted faces, some sporting butterfly wings, others with superhero masks. The aroma of grilled hot dogs and fresh popcorn filled the air, mixing with the sound of a local band playing folksy tunes near the store entrance. Grace stood at the edge of the parking lot, one hand clutching her purse strap. She watched as Jake moved through the crowd, his tall frame and tattooed arms making him easy to spot. Despite his intimidating appearance, children flocked to him, showing off their face paint and asking for more popcorn. He'd shed his usual leather jacket for a Valley Market polo shirt, though it did little to soften his rugged appearance. "Here, sweetie," she heard him say to a little girl with pigtails, kneeling down to her level. "Try the strawberry ice cream. It's from Miller's Dairy just down the road." The girl's face lit up as she accepted the cone, and Jake's gentle smile made Grace's heart twist. From her vantage point, Grace could see how much the store had changed. The once dingy exterior now sparkled with fresh paint in warm earth tones. Hanging baskets full of flowers decorated the entrance, and a hand-painted welcome sign invited customers inside. Through the windows, she could see the new produce displays Jake had installed, filled with local fruits and vegetables. Mrs. Peterson, Grace's former favorite customer, spotted Jake and waved him over. Grace watched as he listened patiently to the elderly woman, nodding and laughing at whatever story she was telling. He'd changed since that day at the checkout counter. There was an ease to his movements now, a quiet confidence that had replaced his former tension. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The crowd thinned as families headed home, children clutching balloons and small prizes from the games. The band played their final song, a gentle melody that floated on the evening breeze. Jake started collecting empty paper plates and cups, depositing them in recycling bins. He worked methodically, speaking quietly with the remaining customers as they said their goodbyes. Grace noticed how they touched his arm or patted his shoulder, gestures of familiarity and trust that would have seemed impossible months ago. Finally, as the last customers departed and the cleanup crew began dismantling tables, Grace stepped out of the shadows. Jake was standing alone near the store entrance, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "It's different now," Grace said softly, coming to stand beside him. Jake turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You came." "I've been watching," she admitted, gesturing to the store. "What you've done here, it's amazing." Jake's shoulders relaxed slightly. "It's not just me. The whole community pitched in." "But you made it happen," Grace said. "You took a chance when everyone else had given up." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the cleanup crew finished their work. The string lights overhead twinkled in the growing dusk, creating a gentle glow around them. "The job offer," Grace said finally, turning to face him. "Is it still open?" Jake nodded, hope lighting his eyes. "It's yours if you want it. Always has been." Grace took a deep breath, thinking of her child, of their tiny apartment, of all the struggles they'd faced. "I do," she said quietly. I want to be part of this. What you've built here, it's more than just a store. It's a second chance. Jake's face softened with relief. That's exactly what it is, Grace. A second chance for all of us. Grace's first morning as manager started early. The sun hadn't yet risen when she unlocked the store's front door, her new keys jingling in her hands. The fluorescent lights hummed to life, illuminating the freshly polished floors and neatly arranged shelves. Jake was already there, his motorcycle parked in its usual spot near the loading dock. She found him in the back office, poring over inventory sheets with a pencil tucked behind his ear. He looked up when she entered, and a warm smile cracked through his weathered features. "Morning," he said, pushing aside the papers. "Ready for day one?" Grace nodded, though her stomach was doing flips. "I think so, just a little nervous." "You've got this," Jake assured her, standing up. "Let me show you around properly this time." They walked through the store together as Jake explained the morning routine. Grace took notes in a small notebook, her neat handwriting filling the pages with opening procedures, vendor contacts, and staff schedules. She was surprised by how thorough Jake was, how he seemed to know every detail of running the store. "The produce delivery comes at 6, Jake explained as they reached the back room. "Tommy's been our guy for years. He'll give you the best prices if you ask about his grandkids first." Grace smiled, adding this to her notes. "You've really thought of everything." "Had to," Jake said, his voice gruff but kind. "This place means too much to too many people to mess it up." As the morning progressed, Grace found herself falling into an easy rhythm. She helped stock shelves, arranged displays, and greeted early customers with growing confidence. Jake stayed nearby, offering guidance when needed, but mostly letting her find her own way. During a quiet moment, Grace watched Jake help Mrs. Peterson reach a high shelf. His tattoo-covered arms, once so intimidating, now seemed less threatening as he carefully handed the elderly woman her favorite tea. "You know," Grace said when Jake returned to the register area, "I never thought I'd be here. Working with you, I mean." Jake leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "Because of how I look?" "Not exactly," Grace admitted. "It's just, when we first met, you seemed so hard, closed off. But now..." She gestured around the store, at the cheerful displays and the steady stream of happy customers. "You've created something special here." "We've created something," Jake corrected her. "I wouldn't be here if you hadn't helped me that day." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the memory. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Jake said firmly. "You didn't. Most people would have just let me fail. But you saw past all this." He gestured to his tattoos and scarred knuckles, and showed kindness to a stranger. They worked side by side through the morning rush, moving in sync as if they'd been doing this for years. Grace noticed how Jake's gruff exterior melted away when he interacted with customers, especially the children who came in with their parents. During a brief lull, Grace found herself organizing receipts in the office. Jake brought her a cup of coffee, made exactly how she liked it, something he'd noticed without her ever telling him. "Jake," she said, accepting the coffee with a grateful smile. "I need to thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I never imagined someone who looked as tough as you could show such kindness. You've given me and my child a chance at a better life." Jake's morning routine was interrupted by the sound of construction across the street. The rhythmic pounding of hammers and whirring of power tools drew his attention to the window. Through the glass, he watched as workers hung a massive banner across what used to be an empty storefront. "Coming soon, Megamart Superstore!" His heart sank. He'd heard rumors about a big chain moving into town, but seeing it become real was different. The coffee in his hand suddenly tasted bitter. Grace walked into his office, carrying a stack of weekly reports. She noticed his tense posture immediately. "What's wrong?" Jake gestured toward the window. Grace moved closer, her eyes widening as she took in the scene across the street. The construction site was massive, at least 3 times the size of their store. "They'll have everything," Jake said, his voice heavy. "Bigger selection, lower prices, probably even a pharmacy." He ran a hand through his graying beard. "We just got this place back on its feet, and now—" Grace set down the reports and stood beside him. Together they watched as more workers arrived, unloading boxes of fixtures and equipment. "All our regular customers will probably switch to them," Jake continued. "Can't blame them either. Times are tough, and cheaper prices are cheaper prices." Mrs. Chen, one of their elderly regulars, walked past the construction site. She paused to read the banner, then hurried into their store. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. "Jake, Grace," Mrs. Chen called out. "Have you seen what they're building?" She made her way to the office, her face creased with concern. "My daughter says those big stores killed all the small businesses in her town." Grace pulled up a chair for Mrs. Chen. "We've just seen it ourselves," she said softly. "Well, I won't shop there," Mrs. Chen declared firmly. "This store has been here since I moved to town 30 years ago. Where else would I get my specialty? Who else knows that I need help reaching the top shelf?" She patted Jake's arm. "And who else would carry my groceries to my car when it's raining?" Jake's expression softened slightly. "Thanks, Mrs. Chen. But they'll probably stock your tea too, and for less money." "It's not about the tea," Mrs. Chen insisted. "It's about community. It's about family." Grace's eyes lit up. "She's right, Jake. Remember when Tommy's daughter was sick last month? You let him adjust his delivery schedule so he could take her to treatments. Would a big corporation do that?" Jake shook his head slowly. "And what about the local produce we get from the Peterson farm?" Grace continued, pulling out a chair and grabbing a notepad. "Or the way we let Mrs. Rodriguez pay in installments when her Social Security check was delayed?" Jake sat down beside her, beginning to see where she was going. "The bulletin board where people post local jobs and services?" "The free coffee for the morning regulars," Grace added, writing quickly. "The emergency deliveries during snowstorms," Mrs. Chen chimed in. Jake looked at the growing list. Each item represented not just a service, but a relationship, a story, a connection to their community. "Maybe we can't compete on price," Grace said, "but we have something they can never buy, real relationships with real people." Jake nodded, feeling his determination return. He pulled his chair closer to Grace's, and together they began brainstorming ways to emphasize their store's unique role in the community. Mrs. Chen stayed, offering suggestions and occasionally patting their hands encouragingly. Jake stood at his office window, watching crowds stream into the newly opened megamart across the street. Their parking lot was packed, while his own store's lot looked patchy with empty spaces. The morning sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and his coffee had gone cold on his desk, untouched. Grace knocked softly before entering. "The numbers from yesterday," she said, placing a folder on his desk. Her voice was gentle, but Jake could hear the worry in it. He nodded without turning around. "How bad?" "Sales are down 30% from last week." Grace moved to stand beside him. Together they watched as another car pulled into Megamart's lot. "They're offering opening week specials. Everything at cost, some items below cost." Jake's jaw tightened. "We can't match those prices. We'd be out of business in a month." Through the window, they could see their regular customers, people they knew by name, walking into Megamart with empty shopping carts. Mrs. Rodriguez, who they'd helped during hard times. Mr. Peterson, whose local produce they still stocked. Even Tommy, Their longtime delivery driver was pushing a cart through Megamart's automatic doors. I thought, Jake's voice cracked slightly. I thought what we built here meant something to them. Grace touched his arm gently. It does, but people are struggling. When you're counting every penny. I know, Jake sighed. He finally turned from the window and slumped into his chair. The leather creaked under his weight, and his tattoos seemed darker against his pale, worried face. Maybe we were fooling ourselves. Maybe there's no place for stores like ours anymore. Grace sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. Remember what you told me when I was afraid to take this job? You said sometimes the biggest risks lead to the best rewards. Jake managed a small smile. Using my own words against me? Someone has to. She pulled out a notebook. Look, I've been thinking. Megamart can beat us on prices, but they can't beat us on heart. Jake leaned forward, his interest piqued. Go on. Remember last month when old Mr. Jenkins couldn't drive because of his hip surgery? We delivered his groceries for free. Megamart would never do that. Grace's voice grew more animated. And when Sarah's kid had allergies, we special ordered those gluten-free cookies she loves. Jake nodded slowly, beginning to see where she was going. The Christmas food drive we did? Exactly. Grace's eyes lit up. We're not just a store, Jake. We're part of people's lives, but maybe... She hesitated, then continued. Maybe we need to make that more official. Jake raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? What if we started a real community outreach program? Not just random acts of kindness, but something organized. Something that shows people we're invested in their lives, not just their money. Jake sat up straighter, his expression changing. The weight of worry began to lift from his shoulders as possibilities formed in his mind. He could see it clearly now. Not just a business strategy, but a way to make their store truly essential to the community. We could start with the elderly, he said, reaching for a pen. Organize regular delivery routes, help them with their shopping. Grace was already writing. And the single parents who can't shop during regular hours? Special opening times just for them, Jake added, his voice growing stronger. With coffee and donuts, they worked together, ideas flowing faster than they could write them down. The sound of customers at Megamart faded into the background as they focused on what made their store different, what made it special. For the first time since Megamart opened, Jake felt hope rising in his chest. Maybe they couldn't compete on price, but they could offer something more valuable, genuine care for their community. The line stretched around the block. Jake blinked twice, not quite believing his eyes. Elderly couples chatted with young mothers. Kids ran between shopping carts, laughing. The morning sun painted everything in warm, golden light, making the Community First Shopping Hour banner above the store entrance glow. I've never seen anything like this, Grace whispered, standing beside him at the store's entrance. She clutched her clipboard, checking off names as people entered. Mrs. Rodriguez waved as she walked in, pushing Mr. Peterson in his wheelchair. My delivery driver had the flu, she explained, but Sarah offered to pick me up on her way here. Inside, the store hummed with activity. Volunteers in bright yellow vests helped elderly customers reach high shelves. A table near the deli offered free coffee and fresh pastries. In the corner, 2 teenagers taught an older gentleman how to use his smartphone to access the store's new delivery app. Look at this, Jake said, pointing to the community board they'd installed. It was covered with colorful posts, babysitting offers, lawn care services, study groups, and ride shares. Their store had become more than just a place to buy groceries. It was a hub where neighbors helped neighbors. The local newspaper reporter, Amy Chen, approached them with her camera. Mind if I get a few shots? This is incredible. Megamart's practically empty today. Grace smiled. We're just giving people what they really need, A place to belong. Jake watched as Tommy, their delivery driver, organized a group of volunteers for the afternoon's home deliveries. They had clipboards and carefully planned routes to reach every homebound customer in town. What had started as a simple delivery service had grown into a full network of community support. "Remember when we thought we'd lose everything?" Grace asked softly, watching a young mother teaching an elderly woman how to use their new self-checkout machine. The older woman was laughing, her fears of technology melting away under patient guidance. "Sometimes the best ideas come from the hardest times," Jake replied. He'd removed his leather jacket, and his tattoo-covered arms were visible in his short-sleeved shirt. Nobody seemed intimidated anymore. They just saw him as Jake, the guy who helped carry their groceries and remembered their grandkids' names. The store's phone rang constantly with new delivery requests and people asking to volunteer. Their small office had become a command center for community outreach. Local farmers dropped off fresh produce, knowing it would reach families in need. High school students earned community service hours helping with deliveries and teaching computer skills. Sarah, the young mother Grace had mentioned earlier, approached them with tears in her eyes. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "The special shopping hours for parents with special needs kids. It's changed our lives. Tommy even brings our groceries when Jason's having a bad day." Grace squeezed her hand. That's what community is for. As the morning rush settled into a steady stream of customers, Jake and Grace took a moment to stand back and observe what they'd created. The store buzzed with conversation and laughter. People weren't just shopping. They were connecting. "You know," Grace said quietly, "when you first bought this place, I thought you were crazy." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with emotion. "But you saw something I didn't. You believed in the power of community when everyone else was focused on prices and profits." Jake shook his head. "You're the one who showed me what real kindness looks like. That day at the register, you helped a stranger when nobody else would. Everything we've built here started with that moment." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their vision of community come to life around them. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming the space where hope had taken root and flourished. Jake leaned against the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. The morning rush had settled into a comfortable hum of activity. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of life and community, something he'd never expected to find when he first walked into this store months ago. Grace moved efficiently between the aisles, helping an elderly woman find her favorite tea brand. Her quiet confidence had grown stronger with each passing day. No longer the timid cashier who'd helped him that fateful morning, she carried herself with gentle authority that commanded respect without demanding it. "Remember when this place was practically empty?" Jake asked, as Grace returned to the counter. "Now look at it." She smiled, adjusting her name tag that now read Store Manager. "It's amazing what a little kindness can do." The produce section, once tired and sparse, now burst with colorful local fruits and vegetables. Old Mr. Jenkins, a local farmer, had started bringing in his organic produce 3 times a week. His vegetables might not look as perfect as the competitors, but customers loved knowing where their food came from. "You know what gets me?" Jake said, his voice gruff with emotion. "A few months ago, I couldn't even buy groceries without my card being declined. I was so focused on myself, on my own problems." He gestured to the bustling store. "Never thought I'd end up here." Grace touched his arm gently. "Sometimes the best changes come when we stop thinking about ourselves and start thinking about others." They watched as Sarah, one of their regular customers, helped an elderly man reach a box of cereal from a high shelf. Without prompting or payment, people had started helping each other. The store had become more than just a business. It was a place where the community came together. Jake's tattoos, once a source of whispers and sideways glances, had become just another part of who he was. Kids would sometimes ask about them, and he'd share cleaned-up versions of his stories, always ending with lessons about making better choices. "I used to think strength meant not needing anyone," Jake admitted, watching a group of teenagers help an older woman load groceries into her car through the window. "But real strength, it's about being there for others, isn't it?" Grace nodded, her eyes bright. "And letting others be there for you, too." The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the Community First sign they'd hung above the customer service desk. Jake remembered the day they'd put it up, how uncertain everything had felt. Now, that simple phrase had become their guiding principle. "You know what's funny?" Jake said, straightening up. "When I bought this place, I thought I was saving it. Turns out it saved me instead." Grace smiled knowingly. "Sometimes that's how it works. When you help others, you end up helping yourself." They stood together, watching their little community move through the aisles. Where Jake had once seen just shelves and products, he now saw connections and possibilities. Each interaction, each small act of kindness, reminded him of how far he'd come from that desperate morning when his card was declined. The weight of near bankruptcy and isolation that had once crushed him had been replaced by something lighter, a sense of purpose, of belonging. His strength now came not from standing alone, but from standing with others. "I never thought I'd say this," Jake murmured, "but I'm grateful for that morning when everything went wrong. If my card hadn't been declined..." Grace squeezed his arm gently. "Sometimes our worst moments lead us exactly where we need to be." The setting sun painted the storefront in warm oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Jake and Grace stood outside, watching as the last customers of the day made their way home. The gentle evening breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery section, a new addition they'd added last month. "Hard to believe how different everything looks now," Jake said, running his hand along the freshly painted wall. Gone were the peeling paint and worn-out signs. The store's exterior now matched its renewed spirit inside, clean, welcoming, and full of life. Grace nodded, her eyes tracking a young mother who was buckling her child into a car seat. "Remember how empty this parking lot used to be? Now we have to think about adding more spaces." Jake chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. The tough exterior that had once seemed permanently etched into his features had softened over the months. His tattoos still told stories of his past, but they weren't the whole story anymore. "You know what I love most about this time of day?" Grace asked, wrapping her arms around herself as the evening air grew cooler. "It's when everything slows down just enough to really see what we've built here." The store's windows glowed with warm light, and through them, they could see their employees restocking shelves and chatting easily with each other. The Community First sign caught the last rays of sunlight, seeming to glow from within. "I was so lost when I first walked in here," Jake admitted, his voice low and thoughtful. "Thought I had nothing left to give anyone. Couldn't even buy my own groceries." He shook his head, remembering that desperate morning. "Then you helped me, even though you didn't have to." Grace smiled, her quiet strength showing in the way she carried herself now. "And look what happened because of that one small moment. You turned around and helped not just me, but the whole community." They watched as Mr. Jenkins's truck pulled away, empty now after delivering tomorrow's produce. The local farmers section had become one of their biggest draws, something the big competitor across the street couldn't match. "You know what means the most to me?" Jake gestured toward the store. "It's not just about making money anymore, it's about making a difference." He paused, looking at the families walking to their cars, the elderly couples helping each other with their bags, the teenagers who now had their first jobs. "Every person who walks through those doors is part of something bigger." The sunset had painted the sky in deeper purples now, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The store's sign lit up automatically, casting a gentle glow over them both. "We did good, didn't we?" Grace asked, her voice carrying a hint of pride she'd never have shown months ago. Jake nodded, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle over him. The weight of his past, the years of anger, the mistakes, the loneliness, felt lighter now. He'd found something he never knew he was looking for. Not just success, but purpose. "Yeah," he said softly. "We did good." They stood there together, watching as the day faded into evening, the store standing as a beacon of what they'd built. Not just a business, but a home for their community. The peace Jake felt wasn't just about the store's success. It was about the journey that had brought him here, the kindness he'd learned to give and receive, and the quiet strength of the woman standing beside him who had shown him what real courage looked like. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.